Lady Chatterley's lover. There was no communication between Ragnar Hall and Trevishall village, none. No caps were touched, no curtsies bobbed. The colliers merely stared. The tradesmen lifted their caps to Connie as to an acquaintance and nodded awkwardly to Clifford, that was all. Gulf impassable, and a quiet sort of resentment on either side. At first Connie suffered from the steady drizzle of resentment that came from the village. Then she hardened herself to it, and it became a sort of tonic, something to live up to. It was not that she and Clifford were unpopular, they merely belonged to another species, altogether from the colliers. Gulf impassable, breach indescribable, such as is perhaps non-existent south of the Trent. But in the Midlands and the industrial north, gulf impassable, across which no communication could take place. You stick to your side, I'll stick to mine. A strange denial of the common pulse of humanity. Yet the village sympathized with Clifford and Connie in the abstract. In the flesh it was, you leave me alone on either side. The rector was a nice man of about 60, full of his duty and reduced, personally, almost to a nonentity by the silent you leave me alone of the village. The miners' wives were nearly all Methodist. The miners were nothing. But even so much official uniform as the clergyman wore was enough to obscure entirely the fact that he was a man, like any other man. No, he was Mr. Ashby, a sort of automatic preaching and praying concern. This stubborn, instinctive, we think ourselves as good as you if you are Lady Chatterley, puzzled and baffled Connie at first extremely. The curious, suspicious, false amiability with which the miners' wives met her overtures. The curiously offensive tinge of, oh dear me, I am somebody now, with Lady Chatterley talking to me. But she needn't think I'm not as good as her for all of that, which she always heard twanging in the women's half-fawning voices, was impossible. There was no getting past it. It was hopelessly and offensively non-conformist. Clifford left them alone, and she learned to do the same. She just went by without looking at them, and they stared as if she were a walking wax figure. When he had to deal with them, Clifford was rather haughty and contemptuous. One could no longer afford to be friendly. In fact, he was altogether rather supercilious and contemptuous of anyone not in his own class. He stood his ground without any attempt at conciliation, and he was neither liked nor disliked by the people. He was just part of things like the Pit Bank and Rugby itself. But Clifford was really extremely shy and self-conscious now he was lamed. He hated seeing anyone except just the personal servants, for he had to sit in a wheeled chair or a sort of bath chair. Nevertheless, he was just as carefully dressed as ever by his expensive tailors, and he wore the careful Bond Street neckties just as before. And from the top, he looked just as smart and impressive as ever. He had never been one of the modern ladylike young men, rather bucolic even, with his ruddy face and broad shoulders. But his very quiet, hesitating voice and his eyes, at the same time bold and frightened, assured and uncertain, revealed his nature. His manner was often offensively supercilious and then, again, modest and self-effacing, almost tremulous. Connie and he were attached to one another in the aloof, modern way. He was much too hurt in himself, the great shock of his maiming, so he be easy and flippant. He was a hurt thing, and as such Connie stuck to him passionately. But she could not help feeling how little connection he really had with people. The miners were, in a sense, his own men, but he saw them as objects rather than men, parts of the pit rather than parts of life, crude, raw, phenomenal, rather than human beings along with him. He was in some way afraid of them. He could not bear to have them look at him now he was lame, and their queer, crude life seem as unnatural as that of hedgehogs. He was remotely interested, but like a man looking down a microscope or up a telescope. He was not in touch. He was not in actual touch with anybody save, traditionally, with Ragby, and through the close bond of family defence with Emma. Beyond this, nothing really touched him. Connie felt that she herself not really touch him. Perhaps there was nothing to get at ultimately, just a negation of human contact. Yet he was absolutely dependent on her. He needed her every moment. Big and strong as he was helpless. He could wheel himself about in a wheeled chair, and he had a sort of bath chair with a motor attachment in which he could puff slowly round the park. But alone, he was like a lost thing. He needed Connie to be there, to assure him he existed at all. Still, he was ambitious. He had taken to writing stories, curious, very personal stories about people he had known. Clever, rather spiteful, and yet in some mysterious way meaningless. The observation was extraordinary and peculiar, but there was no touch, no actual contact. It was as if the whole thing took place in a vacuum. And since the field of life is largely an artificially lighted stage today, the stories were curiously true to modern life, to the modern psychology, that is. Clifford was almost morbidly sensitive about these stories. He wanted everyone to think them good, of the best, ne plus ultra. They appeared in the most modern magazines and were praised and blamed as usual. But to Clifford, the blame was torture, like knives, goading him. It was as if the whole of his being were in his stories. Connie helped him as much as she could. At first she was thrilled. He talked everything over with her monotonously, insistently, persistently, and she had to respond with all her might. It was as if her whole soul and body and sex had to rouse up and pass into the stories of his. This thrilled her and absorbed her. Of physical life, they lived very little. She had to superintend the house, but the housekeeper had served Sir Geoffrey for many years. Arid, the dried-up, elderly, superlative, correct female, you could hardly call her a parlour maid or even a woman who waited at table, had been in the house for 40 years. Even the very housemaids were no longer young. It was awful. What could you do with such a place but leave it alone? All these endless rooms that nobody used, all the Midlands routine, the mechanical cleanliness and the mechanical order. Clifford had insisted on a new cook, an experienced woman who had served him in his rooms in London. For the rest, the place seemed run by mechanical anarchy. Everything went on in pretty good order, strict cleanliness and strict punctuality, even pretty strict honesty. And yet to Connie, it was a methodical anarchy. No warmth of feeling united it organically. The house seemed as dreary as a disused street. What could she do but leave it alone? So she left it alone. Miss Chatterley came sometimes with her aristocratic thin face and triumph, finding nothing altered. She would never forgive Connie for ousting her out from her union in consciousness with her brother. It was she, Emma, who should be bringing forth the stories, these books with him. The Chatterley stories, something new in the world that they, the Chatterleys, had put there. There was no other standard. There was no organic connection with the thought and expression that had gone before. Only something new in the world. The Chatterley books, entirely personal. Connie's father, where he paid a flying visit to Rugby, and in private to his daughter. As for Clifford's writing, it's smart, but there's nothing in it. It won't last. Connie looked at the burly Scottish knight who had done himself well all his life, and her eyes, her big, still wondering blue eyes, became vague. Nothing in it. What did he mean by nothing in it? If the critics praised it and Clifford's name was almost famous and it even brought in money, what did her father mean by saying there was nothing in Clifford's writing? What else could there be? For Connie had adopted the standard of the young. What there was in the moment was everything, and moments followed one another without necessarily belonging to one another. It was in her second winter at Rugby, her father said to her, "I hope, Connie, you won't let circumstances force you into being a demi-verge." "A demi-verge?" replied Connie vaguely. "Why? Why not?" "Unless you like it, of course," said her father hastily. To Clifford, he said the same when the two men were alone. "I'm afraid it doesn't quite suit Connie to be a demi-verge." "A half-virgin?" replied Clifford, translating the phrase to be sure of it. He thought for a moment, then flushed very red. He was angry and offended. "In what way doesn't it suit her?" he asked stiffly. "She's getting thin, angular. It's not her style. She's not the pilchard sort of little slip of a girl. She's a bonny Scotch trout. Without the spots, of course, said Clifford. He wanted to say something later to Connie about the demi-virgin business, the half-virgin state of her affairs. But he could not bring himself to do it. He was at once too intimate with her and not intimate enough. He was so very much at one with her, in his mind and hers, but bodily they were non-existent to one another, and neither could bear to drag in the corpus delicti. They were no so intimate and utterly out of touch. Connie guessed, however, that her father had said something, and that something was in Clifford's mind. She knew that he didn't mind whether she were demi-virgin or demi-monde, so long as he didn't absolutely know and wasn't made to see. What the eye doesn't see and the mind doesn't know doesn't exist. Okay, you must listen to the next video. Watch and listen to the next video of Lady Chatterley's lover to find out what takes place next. For now, listen to the next episode.